And welcome back. Time for Politics Proper and Game Plan 2017. I'll introduce my guests to you and our discussion. To my left is Advocate Kamotho Waiganjo, and to my right is Election Specialist Felix Odhiambo. Gentlemen, you're both welcome to the program. The mass voter registration exercise kicks off tomorrow, and with the plan that we've seen IEBC put in place, what are your initial observations and concerns? Felix?
First of all, I think the media needs to be commended. I've watched over the last few days sustained media campaign, get out the votes and mobilization drives that I think is commendable. And I think the IEBC has also tried to put in place mechanisms for mass voter registration. I remember the last time they did this was last year. Unfortunately, they didn't meet their target. But I think given the preparation that they are saying that they are put in place, I think the efforts are commendable. The rest actually what remains is for the Kenyan people to realize the significance of voter registration and what it means in our democracy and what it means in terms of the regime of rights that are provided for in the Constitution. But also the political parties have a serious role to play because IEBC can only register. But the efforts to get people to go and register, voter mobilization and voter drives actually rest squarely on political parties. And so they really must recognize that role.
How do you feel about it, Kamotho, to the extent that these are also, if you like, the drum beats that really lead to the election at the end of the day? How do you feel about IEBC's preparedness and tomorrow's exercise?
I think, to be honest, I'm a bit cautious. I think two things. One is the news. I think it was sometime late last year, or so around August, when I think the Department of Registration of Persons came up with the statistics that there were about 9 million Kenyans who had identity cards and who had registered to vote. Was scary, you know, because these are people who could register but who had decided not to. That's a very serious indictment of people's faith in the electoral process. Now, the capacity, if assuming that the drum beats that are happening now produce those 9 million, and the others who have since gotten IDs, we're talking about maybe some 10 million people or so coming up in the next 2 weeks or so to register. I pray that IEBC has the logistical capacity to register them without the sort of complaints we've had about delays and all that, because what that does is with a country that's already showing some sort of lethargy, the one thing you don't want to do is to make it difficult for people to register to vote. So I pray for Chiloba and his team that if people do turn out because of the drumbeats that are going on by the various political parties, that they themselves would have the logistical competence to do it and do it quickly, because we cannot afford to have an election which is decided by about, you know, the difference of about 500,000 votes with 10 million people out there who have not voted. That tells you that the content of our democracy is then, you know, significantly prejudiced. So it's important that as many people come out as possible. But if they won't come out, if they go for a day and they've been sitting there since morning and they haven't registered. So I think for me that's I'm a little cautious and hoping that with the 7,000 or so kits, they'll be able to do it and do it well.
Does that concern you in terms of, you know, giving all people an opportunity to register quickly? They're saying almost half of their kits are not functioning, but they've given us a spread which they said basically it follows a similar pattern to the delimitation of boundaries and you know how they're going to place them. Do you think that's a fair spread and something that would enable people to vote, to register quickly?
Well, unfortunately, it is not, and I think we really needed to, and IEBC and the government or parliament needed to have invested more on these BVR kits. But considering the number of BVRs that we have, I think we should take consolation that some countries like Nigeria and Tanzania recently was able to register as many people as possible with the limited BVR kits or inadequate BVR kits. Now, I agree with what Kamotho has said. The onus is actually on IEBC now to understand the limitation and the inadequacies of kits that they have and to come up with innovative ways of reaching out to voters and, you know, the aged, the sick, etc. they should not limit mobile. I mean, BVR kits are very small, and they're mobile. You can go with them to visit, people in their various localities. And they also have to realize that, and I hope that this informs the distribution of these kits, that there are certain areas that, unfortunately, especially Western Province, as we know it, Western Kenya, not Nyanza, Western Province, that unfortunately, and Coast Province, and mostly Eastern Province. These are areas that traditionally, the projection in terms of population density, if you compare the population density and those who are actually registered, the number is very small. So the question is, how can I be? Of course, the political parties must get out there and sort of mobilize these people to come and vote. But the IEBC must recognize that in terms of political interest, some areas are more apathetic than others. And so it is up to the IEBC to come up with innovative ways of ensuring that more BVR kits are allocated in these areas, but that their clerks or their county, their returning officers actually visit and penetrate the lowest units in these areas.
And which areas would you say those are? Kakamega,
Bungoma, the lower eastern, and the entire Coast Province. If you compare population density against those who are registered, the number is very small.
All right.
Yeah.
What are your own observations in as far as, political parties are saying they're going to be able to mobilize 4 million, both sides are saying 4 million voters. Do you think Kenyans are feeling as passionate about these two, if you like, government and opposition, these two sides to show up in the 4 million number, or do you think that's maybe a high estimate in terms of what they can churn out?
I think they're overambitious, and I hope I'm wrong.
Okay.
If the last projections are anything to go by, I think even then there was some mobilization. It didn't produce results. I think the political temperatures have been sort of ignited in the last couple of weeks, which is good actually for the process. The possibility of a combined opposition is actually good for the voter turnout in both sides, So that's not a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing, because what it will do is it will bring out people to register. I suspect what happened in the last voter registration exercise, there was no political incentive for people to come out. There was nothing that was new. But at least now we find something new. But I think for Kenyans, and I think that is a message that needs to go to Kenyans, is that elections are not just about the politicians also. The elections are actually about the Kenyans themselves. And so in a sense, every Kenyan has a national duty to determine the kind of leaders that are going to be there. Because what I think people forget is that the decisions that are made have implications of a second-by-second nature in our lives. Whether we're going to have a peaceful country, whether we're going to have an economy that is thriving, whether we have limited, reduced corruption, whether all these things depend on the vote. And I think Kenyans need to know that we are not doing politicians a favor, because you find nowadays, my political friends tell me, people tell you pay them to register to vote. And I think that is the education that we need to now be telling people, that voting is about you. It's not to elect politicians to employ them so that they can earn a salary. They actually have implications on your life. And I think that's a message that needs to be sent. Whether it will produce voters this season, I doubt. But I think it's a message that needs, every time between the election and the next, we need to keep reminding people that as you complain about the character and content of the politicians that we have, remember you made the decision. And I think that's an important lesson.
But the other reason why that has been blamed on voter apathy in the past has been, the lack of faith in the electoral process. Do you believe IEBC, Felix, has surmounted the credibility issues that it faced, especially last year?
Not yet. And I'll be very honest about that. In as much as a lot of work has happened, and in terms of what IEBC has done over the last few months, development of the operations plan and things like that, I don't think IEBC has reached that credibility threshold that you can safely say that looking at 2017, the IEBC has reached that level where a free, fair, credible election can actually be entrusted to it. Compared, for example, with the Electoral Commission of South Africa or the Electoral Commission of Ghana, the recently concluded elections. A lot still needs to be done. And
what are the concerns?
One, you remember Parliament just passed the law. And let me also emphasize that most of the problems that needs to be done is actually not of IEBC making. The laws were just passed the other day. Regulations would have to be promulgated, for example. IEBC's decision are constantly challenged in court, and I think the voter registration audit and the certain procurement of essential materials have actually been suspended by the court. But those are external factors to IEBC. There are certain things that IEBC must do on its own, like, for example, ensure that there is serious integrity, both at the IEBC offices in Nairobi and their constituencies and the polling stations and the staff and the personnel that they will hire at the polling station, etc. They must go out of their way to try and ensure, work and build the confidence level of the Kenyans. I think when we went to the last election, the confidence rating for IEBC was in excess of 80%. The last opinion polling, I think, placed it at something like 36%. But let me underscore a point that Kamotho Waiganji said. And it's an appeal to Kenyan people. Election is not about politicians. We fought for a new constitution, and one of the reasons why this constitution has been hailed as progressive is the regime of rights that it provides for. And the most important of them all is that sovereignty now reposts on the people. And the constitution went further and entrenched the political rights. Now, the basis and the beginning of enjoyment of all the rights that are provided for in the constitution is through elections, is through participating in the electoral process. And that process is actually anchored in the right to vote and to register as a voter. So Kenyans should understand that to effectively exercise that sovereign power, they must participate in the voting process.
Right. Let's get to the numbers game. And you've heard in the last week both sides saying, you know, it's going to be a door-to-door campaign as far as they're concerned, getting out every last eligible voter out to register and then eventually to vote. Let's begin with the opposition's chances of removing this government from office. Do you think that it lies, A, in making sure that they remedy the issue of low registration in their strongholds, or is it too a question about actually turning out the vote at the end of the day? I think
it's three things. One is that there needs to be an incentive for why people will turn out to vote. And if you look at the elections where the largest voter turnout has been in Kenya's history, you find that there's something usually that's new in the electoral process. So in a sense, the opposition, if it's going to be able to get out its voters and there's going to be apathy, they have to craft something that is different from what they have presented, whatever that means.
Is it the presidential candidate?
And generally, by the way, it's a presidential candidate. But there's also a different issue in this election that is going to determine turnout, and that's the elections at the county level, particularly for the governors. The competitions at the governor level are going to be very, very intense, and that will bring out some numbers. Now, unfortunately, if the people do not register to vote, even at that point, even however much the governors campaign, they just will not have voters because people will not have registered. So in a sense, everyone who is campaigning for the gubernatorial elections, the MCs, must now invest in ensuring that people are coming out to register. Don't wait until that time to vote. But I think another important issue to remember is that, and I want to come to a point that Felix was making about the integrity of the IEBC. I think it's important to recognize that what we are talking about between now and the elections is about trust building. It's about trust building. It is the issue of IEBC's technical capacity and technical competence is important. But actually what IEBC should be investing in now more than anything else is building confidence. And I am not convinced that the building confidence is to politicians. I think where we have reached now with politicians, politicians thrive on wedge issues, and IEBC is a wedge issue. So it's very difficult now to get politicians to review their view of IEBC because it's not convenient. But if I was talking to IEBC, I would be saying, you have very many constituencies out there. You have private sector, you have the church, you have trade unions, you have civil society. These are the people you need to sell your story to so that you increase the constituency of your supporters. If I was IEBC, I would be having a Monday meeting with the media every week and be able to tell the editors of all the media houses, this is where we are at. Because the most important thing that you want to do now is trust build in the electoral process. If you do that, then what we do is we isolate the politicians, because the politicians will have something to say. But in terms of the substance, you ensure that IEBC has a wider constituency of supporters.
Beyond politicians.
Beyond politicians. And yes, the politicians are important stakeholder, and you must do something about it, but don't invest all your energies there. And I think one of the singular failures of IEBC is actually failing to recognize the importance of these other constituencies, particularly in an election year. Because in an election year, politicians' views are already strengthened because they're important for bringing out their numbers.
Right.
We're going to be and by the way, it's not unique to Kenya. How did Donald Trump manage to bring out his voters? By saying the elections are going to be rigged. So this is not unique to Kenya. So what you need is a wider cross-section of supporters and stakeholders.
All right. Let me return to numbers. For the president, you've heard Jubilee saying a lot this time around that it's going to be more than 50+1 for them. They go as far as saying, 60% of the vote, 70% of the vote. Do you believe that Jubilee's chances of retaining the power, if you like, will be either based on getting more people to register already in their strongholds, or is it more about, because they did have the high voter turnout, if you like, in the last election, or is it more about raiding opposition strongholds?
It would have to be, I think, raiding opposition stronghold. If you look at the voter registration and voting in voter registration in 2012 and the 2013 elections, in terms of registration, Jubilee actually exceeded, by and large, their projection. IEBC was able to register, for example, in Kiambu County alone, against its projection, it exceeded the projection by 113%. And the same is with every constituency in Muranga, Nyeri, and most of the constituencies or counties in Rift Valley. And so they would have to, for Jubilee to retain its power, they would have to do impressively well in the so-called opposition stronghold. I think it is not true that if you look at power balance between political parties in this country, it compares very easily with Ghana, where between the two leading coalitions or two leading political parties, for starters, they have approximately 45% Jubilee and 45% CORD. Right. What the contest is all about is about 6 percentage points, or let's say 10 percentage points. Whoever gets 50% plus 1.
Right.
But they are almost balanced in terms of strength. And another indicator to demonstrate that the election of 2017 is not a foregone conclusion for Jubilee or CORD is look at the by-elections. In every by-election since 2013, CORD has almost held the seats and effectively defended its seats very successfully. It doesn't happen like that for an opposition party, or put differently, incumbent parties across Africa normally win by election in non-election years. But I think this is a perfect opportunity for especially the opposition party. And in fact, if you ask me, in terms of who needs to do more work than the other, I would tell you it's CORD. If you look at the voter registration in their strongholds, Kakamega in the last,
to do more work.
More in terms of mobilization, more than Jubilee, because Jubilee sort of met at their threshold in the last registration phase. And by the I was watching TV as at 9 between Kakamega, Nyanza, Western, and Coast. The projection of IEBC is 2.6 million votes. Rift Valley and Central is 1.7 or 1.8. So what it means is that in terms of the people or the party or the coalition that needs to go out there and conduct massive voter mobilization, it's the opposition, because it's in their strongholds that so many people were not registered in the last election, and yes, they really also have to do a lot in terms of get out the vote.
Right. As we wind up, in the previous election, pundits had it that would be an election that was going to be determined by women and youth as the critical voting class, if you like, that would sway the election. Do you think this still holds true going into the 2017 poll?
Well, I don't know. And Felix, you've looked at the numbers. I'm not sure that you have in Kenya such a thing called as the youth vote or the women vote that is different from the other projections. It's generally vote on the same patterns. Obviously, in terms of voter, if you look at the places where people haven't registered to vote, they're generally young people. There are a lot of young people in many areas that haven't come out to vote and who have identity cards. So in a sense, bringing them out is going to be useful. But it is not because they'll vote independent of the voting patterns in the areas where they come from. That's not going to happen. If that was true, you'd find very many youth persons elected to parliament. That doesn't, or women candidates elected to parliament, if people are voting as women or as young people. But I do think there is need to encourage young people, as we've always been told we are the future of this country, the present leadership of this country, to ensure that they are registering to vote. I think it would be very unfortunate for a young person to have an identity card. This country, the rest of your future is in your hands, and you're not coming out to register to vote. So whatever it is that we can do to encourage people to come out, young people to come out and register, I think we must do so. In Kiambu here, if you look at the number of young people who haven't registered to vote, they're in the hundreds of thousands. It's unacceptable. And so in a sense, whatever it is that it takes to encourage the younger people to come out, women actually come out a lot more than young people. So we need to encourage that younger age group between 18 and 25 to register to vote. That's where the challenge is.
Do you think there's a critical voting block in that sense? Women, youth, disadvantaged persons, or not? Is it just one melting pot based on our regions?
I mean, mostly ethnicity has been, and regions is overriding in terms of voting. But having said that, I think there has to be a recognition that the age group between 18 to, I think, 40 comprise the largest chunk of voters in this country. Whether political parties or politicians or candidates will tailor-make their message to target this group effectively is a different matter. But they comprise the largest in terms of, the largest number of demographic. They comprise the largest number of registered voters, and a lot has to be done to mobilize them. But ethnicities and regional consideration have been serious criteria in terms of voting.
Gentlemen, thank you. So tomorrow, get out early and register to vote. Felix and Kamoto, thanks for your words. We're going to be back with more news after this. Stay with us.